Black doctor saves a racist white woman's life. When she wakes up, she is mad. The rain poured like a heavy curtain over the small town, covering everything with a thick layer of water that reflected the faint lights from the street lamps along the empty streets. The constant sound of raindrops hitting the hospital windows served as a steady soundtrack, a background noise for what seemed to be just another long, monotonous night. However, for Emily Jackson, it was just another night on call, one of many she had endured as a surgeon. Emily was used to the exhaustion that came after hours of nonstop work. The physical fatigue was something she had learned to ignore, replacing the weariness with an almost unshakable focus. This was her third consecutive night on duty, but her attention remained sharp. The hospital's break room was empty except for her, as she quickly skimmed through some reports while sipping on bitter, cold coffee that barely did anything to shake off the accumulated fatigue. Life in a small town had never been easy for Emily, especially as a Black woman, and even more so as a highly respected professional. Since childhood, she had felt the sting of suspicious looks and the cruel whispers around the corners. Growing up in an environment where racism was like a constant shadow had made her resilient. Yet, the internal wounds never fully healed. For her, the hospital was one of the few places where she could hide from the shadows of prejudice. In that sterile professional space, she was recognized not for her skin color, but for her skills. Before we continue the story, I'd like to know what city you're watching from. Tell me in the comments, and I'll leave a heart for you. Across town, the scene was completely different. Sarah Miller, a 38-year-old woman, was enjoying a pleasant evening with friends at an upscale restaurant. She was part of the town's elite, the daughter of a traditional and influential family with deep roots in local history. Sarah had always known she was respected, even feared by many. Her status was unquestionable, as were her opinions. To Sarah, the world was simple. There were people like her, and then there were the others. Sitting at the table, Sarah laughed loudly with her friends, her voice echoing through the nearly empty restaurant. "They just don't know their place," she commented, talking about the immigrants and the Black community in town, while taking another sip of wine. Her words were met with laughter, as if prejudice was just another lighthearted topic to liven up the evening. To Sarah, these racist views weren't questioned. They were simply a reflection of the reality she had known since childhood. That's how she saw the world, as if certain people were destined to be inferior, while others, like her, were meant to be on top. After dinner, Sarah said goodbye to her friends and walked to her luxury black sedan, the soft sound of rain in the background. She had drunk more than she should have, but not enough to admit that she shouldn't be driving. She started the car and drove through the dark roads, the only light coming from her headlights cutting through the thick curtain of rain. The fatigue was mixing with the alcohol, and her thoughts drifted back to the night's conversations. She smiled, remembering the jokes they made about the town's workers of color. But then everything changed in the blink of an eye. When Sarah looked ahead, the blinding lights of an oncoming truck momentarily blinded her. She tried to swerve, but the road was slippery. The car spun out of control, skidding violently. The sound of tires screeching on the wet asphalt was followed by a deafening crash. The car slammed into a pole, metal twisted, and shattered glass flew in all directions. The silence that followed was deep and disturbing. Sarah lost consciousness, wrapped in the darkness of the night. At the hospital, Emily had just finished surgery when the emergency alarm went off. Adrenaline surged through her veins again. A serious accident. The victim was on their way, and time would be crucial. Emily put aside her tired thoughts and began preparing, calling the team to the emergency room. When the ambulance finally arrived, bringing the critically injured patient, the scene was chaotic. Nurses rushed around, preparing equipment while the stretcher with the patient was quickly wheeled into the operating room. Emily, her face partially covered by a mask, watched as the woman was brought to the operating table. At first glance, the victim was just another gravely injured patient. But as she approached to check the vital signs and prepare for surgery, She recognized the bruised face of Sarah Miller. For a moment, her heart raced. The town was small, and she knew exactly who Sarah was, not just because of the family's reputation, but because of the unpleasant encounters they had shared. Sarah was one of the loudest, most openly racist voices in town. Her venomous comments about the local black community were no secret, and Emily had been the target of her words on multiple occasions. The irony of the situation didn't escape her. There was Sarah, unconscious and vulnerable, placed in the hands of a black doctor she so despised. Emily's initial instinct was to hesitate. She knew exactly what Sarah thought of people like her, but professional ethics spoke louder. Emily took a deep breath, pushed aside all personal thoughts, and began the work she knew best. In that moment, Sarah wasn't a racist woman. She was a life in danger, and Emily was there to save that life, no matter what. The surgery was long and complex. Sarah had suffered multiple fractures and internal bleeding, and Emily's work required absolute precision. The atmosphere in the operating room was cold and sterile, but the tension was palpable. The sound of heart monitors filled the air, punctuated by Emily's quick commands to the team. Every move needed to be calculated, every second counted. Emily focused intensely on the task, blocking out any thoughts that didn't involve saving Sarah's life. After hours of hard work, Emily managed to stabilize Sarah. The monitors now showed steady vital signs, and the worst seemed to be over. Exhaustion finally caught up with Emily, but she allowed herself a brief moment of relief. As the team prepared to move Sarah to the ICU, Emily stepped back and looked at the woman she had just saved. The irony of the situation hung in the air, but Emily knew the real confrontation would come when Sarah woke up. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the machines beside the bed. Sarah Miller slowly woke up, as if she were emerging from a long, deep nightmare. Her senses returned gradually. The sharp pain in her body was a clear sign that something terrible had happened. As her eyes struggled to focus on the ceiling above, the last fragments of memory floated through her mind. The accident, the deafening noise, the darkness. And now, the heavy silence of the hospital. The wires connecting her to the machines monitoring her vital signs felt like a web trapping her, and breathing became difficult. She tried to lift her head, but weakness pinned her against the mattress. She felt helpless and vulnerable, and frustration started to grow within her. She needed answers. "Nurse," her voice came out low, hoarse, and almost inaudible. She tried again louder. Someone help me." A few minutes later, footsteps echoed down the hallway, approaching her room. The door opened softly, revealing a woman in a white coat. The doctor entered, holding a chart in her hands, and approached the bed with firm steps. Sarah blinked, adjusting her eyes to the soft light now illuminating the room. As the woman drew closer, Sarah felt a sharp discomfort. Something about her face seemed familiar. "Good morning, Sarah," the doctor said, her voice professional, but without familiarity. "I'm Dr. Emily Jackson. How are you feeling today?" Sarah blinked again, trying to absorb the situation. The name Jackson echoed in her mind, and then something clicked. Her, the black doctor. A wave of shock ran up Sarah's spine. She abruptly lifted her head, which sent a sharp pain through her broken ribs. But the indignation in her chest was stronger than any physical pain. "You?" Her voice was louder than she intended, trembling with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Emily, clearly accustomed to such reactions, remained calm and composed. "I'm the surgeon who operated on you after the accident. You suffered serious injuries, but we were able to stabilize your condition. You're recovering well." For a moment, silence hung in the room, broken only by the soft beeping of the machines. Sarah's face twisted in anger as Emily's words sunk in. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. A mix of shock and disgust filled her chest as she realized that her life had somehow been in the hands of the very woman she had despised so much, and who had now, inexplicably, saved her life. This must be some kind of joke, Sarah shouted, her voice starting to fail under the intensity of her emotions. Call a real doctor. I want someone else to check me now. Emily kept her composure, having encountered similar situations before, though never with such personal emotional weight. I'm the doctor responsible for your case, Sarah. I'm the one who operated on you and made sure you survived. There isn't another doctor more qualified in this hospital to take care of you. Sarah's body stiffened. Her face turned red with indignation, her eyes shining with an irrational rage she couldn't control. No, you're not. I can't have been operated on by you. The words came out as if she were choking. You shouldn't even be here. This is unacceptable. I demand another doctor. Sarah's fury only grew with each word, as if she were drowning in her own prejudice. The idea that Emily, the surgeon she despised without truly knowing, had been the person responsible for saving her life was something Sarah couldn't and didn't want to accept. She began to tug at the wires from the monitors with a trembling hand. I'll really die if you stay here. I'm feeling sick. Someone please, give me a real doctor. The words real doctor dripped with venom, as if Emily had no right to be there. Emily watched in silence for a few seconds. She knew that nothing Sarah said or did could change the fact that it had been her who had saved the woman's life. Still, the open hostility, the unfiltered hatred, was a blow that always left scars, no matter how much she tried to shield herself. But Emily wouldn't let it break her. The emotional control she had learned over the years, both as a doctor and as a black woman in a hostile environment, wouldn't be undone by this outburst of fury. Sarah, Emily said, her voice firm but with a touch of compassion that Sarah didn't expect. I understand that you're confused and maybe scared, but you're alive because I did my job. And I will continue to do it because that's what I swore to do. Sarah, now breathing heavily, closed her eyes tightly, trying to hold back tears of frustration and helplessness. The anger and fear mixed into an uncontrollable storm of emotions. She refused to look at Emily, as if ignoring her could make this truth disappear. The door opened again, and a nurse walked in, drawn by the commotion. Is everything okay, doctor? She asked, glancing from Emily to Sarah, clearly confused by the situation. She's feeling sick, Sarah said in a trembling, almost hysterical voice. I want another doctor. I can't be treated by her. The nurse, visibly uncomfortable, looked to Emily for guidance. Emily took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. Sarah is going through emotional shock. We'll adjust the post-op medication and monitor her vital signs. But for now, she needs rest. The nurse nodded and quickly left, leaving the two women alone in the room. Sarah, now gasping for breath, turned her face to the window, trying to distance herself from reality. The tension was palpable, but Emily knew there was nothing more to say. She had done what she could, saved a life. Whether Sarah chose to accept that fact or not was beyond her control. With one last glance at her patient, Emily left the room in silence, gently closing the door behind her. As she walked down the hallway, she felt the weight of what had happened, not just in the room, but throughout her entire life. The racism that permeated interactions in her town was something she couldn't cure with a simple surgery. Some scars, she knew, were invisible and difficult to treat. The hospital atmosphere was calmer that afternoon, with the corridors clear to the usual frenzy of an emergency. Emily Jackson was reviewing charts at the nursing station, still processing the recent events involving Sarah Miller. The hostility Sarah had displayed, the refusal to accept that she had been saved by Emily, was something that affected her on a personal level, even though she tried not to show it. However, as a doctor, she knew she had to follow protocol. There was a routine checkup scheduled to monitor Sarah's progress, and despite the tension between them, Emily knew her duty as a surgeon could not be influenced by conflicting emotions. She had performed the operation successfully, but Sarah's condition still required close monitoring, especially given the severity of the injuries she had suffered in the accident. It was important to ensure that her recovery continued without complications. Taking a deep breath, Emily walked down the corridors towards Sarah's room, maintaining her neutral, professional expression. Upon opening the door, the room was calm, but the tension was still palpable. Sarah lay in bed, her eyes fixed on the opposite wall, deliberately ignoring Emily's presence. The silence was almost deafening. "Good afternoon, Sarah," Emily said softly, keeping her tone courteous, although she anticipated a cold reception. "I came to see how you're feeling. We've been monitoring your recovery closely, and I'd like to run a few routine tests to make sure everything is progressing as expected." Sarah didn't respond. She remained lying there, her eyes locked on a distant point, as if she hadn't even heard Emily's words. The tension in the air grew with each passing second, and her lack of response was intentional. Emily waited patiently, but when it became clear that Sarah wasn't going to cooperate, she moved closer to the bed to check the equipment and her vital signs. "Sarah, I need you to tell me how you're feeling. This is part of the follow-up protocol," Emily insisted, maintaining her calm tone. But again, there was no response. The silence now felt less like a sign of pain and more like a deliberate attempt to ignore Emily's presence. Realizing that this silent confrontation wasn't going anywhere, Emily took a step back and pressed the call button for the nursing staff. A few minutes later, Nurse Kate entered the room, immediately noticing the tension. "Please check the patient," Emily said, pointing to Sarah. "She refuses to speak with me." Sarah finally moved, but not to respond to Emily. In a cold and firm voice, she spoke directly to Kate, without even looking in Emily's direction. "I want another doctor. I won't be treated by her. Get someone else in here immediately." The nurse looked to Emily, unsure of what to do, but Emily, maintaining her professional stance, nodded slightly. "Call the attending physician to continue monitoring the case," Emily said, before quietly leaving the room without saying another word. Sarah waited patiently until the door closed, and as soon as Emily was out of sight, she grabbed the phone beside her bed and quickly dialed the number of her closest friend, William. Her hand shook with frustration as she waited for him to pick up. "Will, I can't take this anymore," she said, barely containing her rage. "I want to get out of here. Now. This surgeon is killing me. I want to be transferred to another hospital immediately." On the other end of the line, William tried to calm her down. "Sarah, relax. What's going on? You're already recovering. It doesn't make sense to transfer you now. You don't understand." Sarah's voice rose a few tones, her anguish mixed with disdain. "She's the reason I still feel like this. I know something is wrong because she was the one who did the surgery. I demand that you arrange my transfer. I'm not staying here another minute." William, realizing that Sarah was on the verge of an emotional breakdown, agreed to help. All right. I'll make a few calls and see what I can do to transfer you. But you'll need to be patient, Sarah. This might take some time. I don't have patience, Will. I want to leave here as soon as possible." The urgency in her voice was clear. To Sarah, the only way to escape the emotional burden she felt was to completely distance herself from Emily and everything that reminded her of that humiliating confrontation. After hanging up, Sarah remained lying there, her thoughts spinning out of control. She was convinced that her recovery was being hindered simply by Emily's presence as her doctor. In her mind, prejudice had distorted reality, making her believe that the treatment she had received was inadequate, even though all the evidence pointed to the contrary. In the following hours, William managed to expedite the transfer. He contacted a private hospital in a nearby city, and after several calls and negotiations, everything was arranged for Sarah to be transferred there as quickly as possible. However, the situation began to take a turn when Sarah's condition suddenly worsened. As the hospital staff prepared the documents and carried out the necessary procedures for the transfer, Sarah began to feel sharp chest pain. An unbearable pain radiated through her ribs, causing shortness of breath and intensifying her discomfort. The sensation was unlike anything she had felt since the accident, and soon the situation escalated. Seeing Sarah pale, and struggling to breathe. Nurse Kate rushed to get help. Quick tests revealed that something was seriously wrong. There was likely an internal complication, probably a previously undetected hemorrhage, and Sarah needed emergency surgery to correct the problem before it became fatal. Confusion took over the hospital. Sarah's transfer was immediately suspended, and the medical team sprang into action to prepare her for surgery. However, upon hearing that she would need another operation, panic overtook Sarah. She struggled to speak, despite the excruciating pain that racked her body. "No, it can't be her," she said, her voice trembling and broken by her difficulty breathing. I won't let her operate on me again." The nurse tried to calm her. "Sarah, you're in serious condition. We need to operate now, and Dr. Jackson is the most qualified to perform this procedure." Sarah shook her head, fear dominating her expression. "No, she did this to me. I'm like this because of her." The words were filled with irrational desperation, her mind twisting the facts in the midst of fear and prejudice. The medical team, visibly torn between the urgency to act quickly and Sarah's obstinate refusal, tried to find a solution. Time was running out, and every second of hesitation put Sarah's life at greater risk. Kate ran off to find Emily, while the other doctors attempted to soothe Sarah and prepare the operating room as quickly as possible. When Emily received the news that Sarah was in critical condition and needed a second surgery, she immediately knew that the confrontation wasn't over. Even with the seriousness of the situation, she was aware that Sarah would probably still see her as the enemy, despite being on the brink of death. The emergency room was filled with tension. Monitors beeped alarms as the medical team moved frantically around Sarah, who was fighting against a pain that now seemed uncontrollable. Her breathing was irregular, her body drenched in sweat, and the panic intensified with each passing second. The once quiet room was now filled with voices discussing the next steps. The diagnosis was clear: a severe internal hemorrhage that hadn't been detected during recovery. Sarah needed another surgery, and she needed it immediately. But the looming question wasn't just about what to do, but about who would perform the surgery. The team knew that Emily Jackson was the most qualified surgeon in the hospital, with extensive experience in complex cases like this. But she wasn't currently at the hospital. After the last confrontation with Sarah, Emily had left for a brief rest, knowing that any attempt to continue Sarah's treatment would result in more resistance and hatred. The on-call doctors, young and talented, understood what needed to be done, but none of them had the experience that Emily possessed in such delicate cases. The conversation grew more urgent as the team weighed the risks of transferring Sarah to another hospital. The town was small, and the nearest hospital with the necessary infrastructure was more than an hour away. Given the severity of the hemorrhage, it was almost certain that Sarah wouldn't survive the journey. "We need someone with experience," murmured one of the doctors, quickly reviewing Sarah's tests. "She won't last much longer without intervention." Nurse Kate, who was at Sarah's side, tried to comfort her, but she knew the options were limited. "Sarah," she said, trying to keep her voice calm, "we need to act fast. Dr. Jackson isn't at the hospital right now, but we can contact her. She has the most experience with this kind of surgery." Sarah's eyes opened slowly, her pale face contorted with pain and desperation. Upon hearing Emily's name, a new wave of fear and rejection filled her mind. Even in this weakened state, she refused to accept Emily's help. "No," she murmured with difficulty, her breath shallow. "I don't want her." Kate looked to the other doctors, all of whom were already aware of the complicated dynamic between Sarah and Emily. The only other option was to transfer her to another hospital, but the chances of her surviving the trip were minimal. The dilemma was cruel: accept help from the surgeon she despised, or risk dying in an attempt to escape. William, who had arrived at the hospital shortly after Sarah's condition worsened, approached her and took her hand, his face filled with concern. "Sarah, you need to listen. Time is running out. We don't have enough time to take you to another hospital." The only person who can save you now is Dr. Jackson. Sarah tried to move, her body writhing in pain, but she still refused to accept what everyone around her was saying. Her mind was at war. How could she allow the woman she despised, the one she had blamed for her condition, to be responsible for saving her again? The irony was crushing, and her wounded pride even greater. "Call another doctor," she insisted, almost pleading. "I would rather another hospital." William glanced at Kate, who shook her head sadly. "There's no more time, Sarah," Kate said, her voice low but urgent. "The transfer could worsen your condition, and no one here has the necessary experience for this kind of surgery. Dr. Jackson is your best chance to survive." Those words seemed to echo in Sarah's mind. Your best chance to survive. She knew Kate was right. The pride that had fueled her hatred was slowly being consumed by the growing fear of dying. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, a mix of pain, frustration, and despair. She looked to William, trying to find a way out, but there was only one choice, and she knew what it was. However, before Sarah could make a clear decision, Kate had already acted. Knowing how critical the situation was, the nurse had called Emily as soon as they realized the gravity of the emergency. Emily, who was only a few blocks away from the hospital, received the call and immediately returned to the medical center. Despite everything that had happened, her duty as a doctor took precedence. She knew Sarah's life was in danger, and no matter what Sarah thought of her, Emily was committed to saving lives, regardless of the circumstances. When Emily re-entered the hospital, the looks on the medical team's faces were a mixture of relief and uncertainty. She knew she would be met with hostility, but she didn't hesitate. She headed straight for Sarah's room, where the doctors were preparing to start the procedure as quickly as possible. Upon entering the room, she saw Sarah lying there, pale and fragile, struggling to breathe. There was something different in Sarah's gaze now. The arrogance and contempt had disappeared, replaced by fear and, perhaps, regret. Emily approached the bed, maintaining her professional demeanor but with a faint shadow of compassion in her eyes. She knew this was a delicate moment, both for the surgery and for Sarah herself. "Sarah," Emily began, her voice soft but firm, "the situation is critical. If we don't act now, the hemorrhage could be fatal. I know you didn't want me as your doctor, but I'm here to save you if you'll let me." Sarah tried to speak, but the words got lost in the weakness that overtook her body. Her eyes began to close, and she felt the darkness creeping in, as if she were on the verge of losing consciousness. The pain was unbearable, and the fear of dying finally overpowered any resentment she still carried. She raised her trembling hand and murmured, almost inaudibly, "Save me." Emily didn't hesitate. Seeing the last bit of resistance dissolve, she prepared to act quickly. She ordered the team to start prepping the operating room immediately, knowing that every second mattered. The tension in the air was palpable, but Emily was focused. It didn't matter what Sarah thought of her. In that moment, there was only one goal: to save this woman's life, just as she had done before. The operating room was prepared with impressive speed. The rhythm in the hospital had changed abruptly. Every movement by the nurses and doctors was coordinated with precision, all aware of the urgency of the situation. Sarah Miller was about to undergo her second surgery, and this time, there was no room for error. Time was of the essence. The internal hemorrhage was severe, and if not controlled quickly, the consequences would be fatal. Emily Jackson, back in the hospital and fully focused on the task at hand, entered the operating room with the calm, resolute posture that had made her one of the best surgeons in the city. The bright lights above the operating table reflected her determined expression as she prepared for the procedure. The emotional weight of everything that had happened over the past few days was there, but Emily knew that, at that moment, she had to put aside all personal feelings. What mattered now was saving Sarah's life again. On the other side of the wall, in the waiting area, William and Kate waited anxiously. The atmosphere was heavy with tension and concern. William paced back and forth, unable to stand still. He knew that despite all of Sarah's mistakes and the harsh words she had spoken, she was now in the hands of the only person who could truly help her. The irony of the situation made him reflect. How had things gotten to this point? How had Sarah allowed hatred and prejudice to cloud her vision so much that she almost preferred to die rather than be saved by someone she had judged as inferior? "Will she be okay?" William asked, stopping in front of Nurse Kate, who was seated, watching the hospital monitors for updates. Kate, ever the optimist, tried to offer a reassuring smile. "Dr. Jackson is the best surgeon we have, Will. If anyone can save her, it's her." Inside the operating room, Emily maintained her precise, calculated movements, but the seriousness of the procedure was felt with each action. The damaged tissue, the ongoing hemorrhage, and the condition of Sarah's internal organs made the procedure even more delicate than anticipated. Every second counted, and any misstep could be fatal. Emily was acutely aware of this, but her experience and skill kept her steady. She knew exactly what needed to be done. As the team assisted her, Emily issued firm, clear commands, never losing control for a moment. The steady beeping of Sarah's heart monitor was a constant reminder that the fine line between life and death was being walked carefully. The hemorrhage was finally located, but the damage was extensive. Emily would need all of her expertise to stabilize Sarah before it was too late. Emily's hands moved with near-surgical precision, without hesitation, without error. She had performed this type of operation before in similar situations, but this time there was an additional emotional weight she couldn't ignore. Sarah was not just another patient, but someone who carried the burden of prejudice, who had tried to resist Emily's help until the very last moment. The symbolism of this operation was not lost on anyone present. Hours passed, though they felt like minutes to the surgical team, completely immersed in their work. Finally, the hemorrhage was controlled, and Sarah's vital signs began to stabilize. The risk was still there. The recovery would be long and difficult. But for now, the worst had passed. Emily stepped back, taking a deep breath for the first time since the surgery began. She had done what needed to be done. Once again, Sarah was out of danger. "All done," Emily announced to the team, who collectively sighed in relief. "We're finished here. Let's monitor her vitals and move her to the ICU." Now we wait. Hours later, Sarah slowly woke up in the ICU, her body still fragile and sore from the operation. Her mind was clouded by anesthesia and medication, but little by little, she began to remember what had happened. The intense pain, the fear of death, and Emily. She had begged Emily to save her, something she could never have imagined doing. The weight of what that meant started to sink in. When Sarah fully opened her eyes, the first person she saw was William, sitting by her bedside, holding her hand with a look of relief and concern. "Sarah," he whispered, noticing that she was waking up. "You're alive? Thank God." She tried to smile, but exhaustion still gripped her body. Her mind, however, was active. The memories of the surgery and her final plea to Emily were returning slowly. The reality of what had happened hit her hard. Emily Jackson had saved her again. William saw the expression on Sarah's face change as her memories resurfaced, and anticipating her question, he said, "It was Dr. Jackson, Sarah. She came back to the hospital for you. She saved your life." Sarah closed her eyes tightly, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions she was feeling. The remnants of her former anger now seemed ridiculous and small in the face of the enormity of what had happened. She had come to the brink of death, and even after everything, the woman she despised had chosen to come back and save her life once again. The silence between her and William felt like it lasted an eternity, until the door to the room opened and Emily walked in, her face calm and professional, but with a faint trace of exhaustion in her eyes. Sarah couldn't look away. For a long moment, the two women just stared at each other, wordlessly. Emily was the first to break the silence, always focused on her patient's well-being. "Sarah, you're stable now, The surgery was successful. Your body will need time to fully recover, but you're going to be okay. Sarah didn't know what to say. For the first time, she didn't have sharp or venomous words ready. She felt small, vulnerable, and above all, grateful. A gratitude that was unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and overwhelming. When she finally found her voice, she didn't look directly at Emily, but her words came out quietly, almost a whisper. "Thank you." Emily remained silent for a moment, studying Sarah's face. There was no satisfaction in hearing those words. For Emily, her duty had been fulfilled. The words of gratitude were an unexpected bonus, but they didn't change what she already knew about herself and her work. She nodded slightly. "I'm glad you're doing well," Emily replied, her voice calm and controlled, before turning to leave the room. As Emily left the room, a wave of emotions swept over Sarah. Shame, humiliation, regret, and gratitude swirled inside her. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt the true weight of her prejudices and how close they had come to destroying her. Now, lying in that hospital bed, alive thanks to the woman she had despised, Sarah knew that the world, as she had seen it, would never be the same again. Time passed slowly for Sarah Miller. The recovery was difficult, both physically and emotionally. Each day in a hospital seemed to drag on as she wrestled with a new reality that had been brutally and unexpectedly forced upon her. Though her body was healing, her mind was still trapped in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Sarah spent hours lying in her hospital bed, alone, except for the brief visits from William, who brought words of encouragement and tried to ease the suffocating silence. But even he seemed to understand that Sarah needed space to process everything that had happened. Her old worldview, so rigid and unshakable, had begun to crumble. At times, Sarah found herself staring at the monitors blinking beside her bed, remembering how close she had come to death. The feeling of vulnerability was still fresh, as was the fact that her life had been saved twice by the same woman she had despised. Now, Emily Jackson occupied a space in her thoughts that Sarah couldn't push away, no longer as the other, the inferior, but as the doctor who had saved her without hesitation. Days after the surgery, while Sarah was still recovering in the ICU, she began to realize that something inside her had changed irrevocably. The image she had of Emily was constantly evolving. Sarah had been raised to believe in the superiority of her social status, in the purity of her position, and in the natural division between them and us. But that teaching had failed to account for the harsh truth that, in the face of death, everyone is equal. The prejudice she had clung to like a shield now seemed not only unnecessary, but absurd. One morning, while Sarah watched the movement of the hospital through the window of her room, she heard a soft knock at the door. When she looked back, she saw Kate, the nurse who had accompanied her throughout the process, entering with a shy smile. "Good morning, Sarah. How are you feeling today?" Sarah hesitated before responding. "Better, I think," she said with a tired sigh. It was still hard for her to admit weakness, but something in her voice no longer carried the same hardness as before. "I'm glad to hear that," Kate replied as she adjusted the monitors. "Dr. Jackson asked me to check on your recovery. She'll be coming by later to do one last follow-up before we discuss your discharge." At the mention of Emily's name, Sarah froze. It was as if all the emotions she had been trying to suppress for the past few weeks were on the verge of exploding. She knew that eventually she would have to face Emily again, but the thought still terrified her. Kate noticed Sarah's discomfort and, after a brief pause, added she didn't have to come back that night. "When I called her, she was already off duty and could have said no. But she came back for you. I'm not sure if you knew that." Sarah looked down, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the blanket in her hands. I didn't know." The weight of gratitude began to rise within her again, but there was still something holding her back. The shame of everything she had said and done wouldn't leave her in peace. Later that same day, Emily entered Sarah's room for the final consultation before her discharge. The room was silent, except for the soft hum of the machines by the bed. Sarah, already expecting her, tried to prepare herself mentally, but nothing could ease the heavy burden of guilt and embarrassment she felt. Emily approached, professional as always, with the patient's chart in hand. "Sarah, how are you feeling today?" she asked, her voice calm and composed. Sarah took a deep breath, fighting back the wave of emotions rising within her. "I'm fine. Better," she replied, her voice softer than usual. She still couldn't look Emily in the eye, but she knew it was time to speak. She needed to say something. There was an uncomfortable silence as Emily checked the vital signs and reviewed the latest reports. Everything indicated that Sarah was finally out of danger, but the tension in the air was something neither of them could ignore. After a few seconds, Sarah finally spoke, her voice hesitant. I want to apologize," she said, as if the words were weighing heavily on her tongue. "For what I said, for what I did. I was wrong." Emily paused for a moment, lifting her eyes from the chart to look at Sarah. Though she had heard many apologies over the course of her career, she knew that, for Sarah, those words represented something much deeper. It was the beginning of the breaking down of barriers she had built up for so many years. "You don't need to apologize," Emily said, maintaining her gentle tone. "I was just doing my job, as I would for any patient." "I know," Sarah muttered, feeling the weight of those words. "But that's not it. I was awful. And yet, you came back. You still saved me." Emily remained silent for a few seconds, absorbing what Sarah was trying to say. "I came back because saving lives is what I do. It doesn't matter who the patient is. What happened between us doesn't change that." Sarah, still feeling small in the presence of Emily's greatness, nodded slightly, unable to fully express what she was feeling. The truth was, Emily had shattered something inside her, not in a destructive way, but in a liberating one. She now saw the world differently, although she still didn't know what to do with that new perspective. Before leaving, Emily gave Sarah one last look. "Take care of yourself, Sarah, and if you need any further follow-up, I'll be here." And with that, she left the room. After being discharged, Sarah finally went home, but the experience at the hospital followed her like a shadow. She constantly reflected on her life up to that point, on the things she had believed, and on the choices she had made. The image of Emily, calmly doing her job without hesitation or resentment, haunted her. It was as if life had given her a second chance to start over. But Sarah didn't know where to begin. William continued to visit her regularly, always offering support and trying to guide her through the process of acceptance and change. He knew that, although the path to redemption was long, Sarah was finally open to the possibility of walking it. It wouldn't be easy, and old habits don't break overnight. But something had changed forever. The physical scar from the accident would mark Sarah for the rest of her life. But the invisible scars, the ones she carried in her heart and mind, were the ones that would transform her the most. Months later, Sarah's life had changed quietly. The social circle that once surrounded her began to seem distant and meaningless. The conversations and opinions that had once gone unquestioned now deeply disturbed her. She was still learning to deal with the new person she was becoming, someone who was starting to see the value in people she had once ignored or despised. The road to redemption was long, but Sarah had begun to walk it one step at a time. She knew that she might never have the courage to fully explain to Emily how she felt. But in her own journey, Emily would always symbolize that turning point. The doctor who saved her twice, once from physical death and once from spiritual death. The invisible scars Sarah now carried would forever be a reminder that some battles happen within us. And sometimes, we need to be broken in order to finally start rebuilding ourselves. If you were also touched by Emily's strength, professionalism, and compassion in saving Sarah's life twice, leave a heart emoji in the comments in honor of this incredible doctor who demonstrated the true meaning of dedication and humanity. Let's spread love and recognition for those who make a difference.